and I'm the president and CEO of DNR Greenway Land Trust. And as you know, DNR Greenway's mission is to preserve land and to take care of land, to manage for conservation of wildlife and restoration of habitats, in addition to allowing trails where we keep our open space open for public access. And we have found during this period of the pandemic that there have been many more people that have come out onto our properties and have enjoyed those properties and walking on those trails. I would say overall, we've seen a 200 to 300% increase in the people that are out on the trails on a regular basis. And I think that's true across the country with other land trusts and other parklands. So one of the questions that comes to mind for all of us is that while we as humans are needing and enjoying being outdoors in nature, on trails, bird watching, enjoying the wildlife that we see there and enjoying the fresh air and open space, how is that affecting the wildlife? And so we've had a real interest in going to some of our experts in the area and finding out how does the changes that have occurred during this COVID pandemic affect the wildlife in terms of additional noise that might be coming to the properties because more people are out on the trails, in terms of the traffic, which has actually in many cases, until recently, I would say declined significantly. And how does that affect wildlife in terms of migration patterns and their habitat areas? And so to find out more about that, we've gone to several experts that you're going to hear from today. And what I'd like to do is introduce them now. And then you'll hear from each of them in turn, and I'll just come in between very briefly. So I'll do most of that introduction right now. The first person you will hear from will be Maria Stahl. And Maria is DNR Greenway's newest employee. She is a conservation biologist who just graduated from Princeton University in ecology and biology. And she is going to be talking with us about some of the research work she did as a student in the African savannah. She was just recently written up by Princeton University for that work, and we included the link to that in the constant contact email that went out on Wednesday, just yesterday. So if you haven't seen that, you might take a look at that. It's very interesting. And she's going to share some of her photos and some of the observations that she made while in Africa. We're then going to hear from Allison Injaian. And Allison is a conservation biologist who has a tremendous background and many degrees in looking specifically at noises and how they affect wildlife and birds in particular. So Allison has degrees from Ursinus College, where she met DNR Greenway's Assistant Director of Land Stewardship, Cindy Taylor, and Cindy introduced Allison to us. She also graduated with her master's in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Michigan, and she received her doctorate in animal behavior from the University of California at Davis. She worked as a postdoc at the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics in the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell, and she is now at the University of Georgia at the Odom School. The way that we were introduced to Allison is that we had a property owner who reached out to us because there was excessive noise on a property next door to them. And because they had preserved their property for bird habitat, they wondered how that was affecting the birds. And when Cindy introduced us to Allison, she shared some papers with us that she's willing to share with any of you that are interested in doing further research. So we can share those if you get back to Deb Kilmer after this program today. We will send you specifically those papers that Allison wrote, as well as the some links to some additional information. And then we're going to hear from David Wheeler, who is the executive director of Conserve Wildlife New Jersey. And David has been there since 2012. He's greatly expanded the programs of Conserve Wildlife. He's a celebrated author on the wildlife in New Jersey, and I believe is a longtime New Jerseyan. I met David when he came out to DNR Greenway's Johnson Education Center a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, and we had an exhibit that was premiered at the Johnson Education Center galleries, and it was a Conserve Wildlife exhibit created by artist James Fiorentino of endangered species of wildlife in New Jersey. And that exhibit traveled for 3 years and did a lot of good in terms of educating people about the wildlife that we have in our state and how they could be protected. So we're delighted that David is able to join us and share with us about what types of observations his conservation biologists are seeing during this COVID pandemic, what trends he might be seeing beginning, and also how this has changed the work of conservation biologists. What's really happening with Conserve Wildlife New Jersey right now? What type of work can you do and what's been impacted by the pandemic? So with that, I'll just state that you're all on mute as you entered. Please stay on mute so that we don't have background noise and we can all hear the speakers. They'll be sharing, each one has a PowerPoint they'll be sharing with us. So you'll have a chance to see some wonderful slides and statistics. And if you have questions or comments during the program, you can go to the bar at the bottom and you'll see a chat. And if you would like, you can enter any comments or questions in the chat and we'll monitor those and bring those to the attention of the speakers when time allows. So with that, again, I want to thank you for joining this virtual community. And I would like to turn the program over to Maria, who will talk about how she began her work in conservation and what she's doing with us. Thank you, Maria.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I'll share my slides with you here. And we'll get started. I hope you all can see that okay. Great. So before I start talking about my research in Mozambique on controlled burns in the African savannah, I wanted to tell you a bit about my background, how I got interested in pursuing a career in conservation, and what I've been doing here at DNR Greenway as the new Community Conservation Fellow. So to start off, I grew up near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I just graduated from Princeton with a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology, as Linda mentioned. And like most ecologists, especially those that grew up in Wisconsin, it was Aldo Leopold that really got me excited about learning about the natural history of the world around me. One of the most memorable experiences I had in high school was a 10-day excursion I went on with one of my classes in which we canoed the length of the Milwaukee River, ending in Lake Michigan, and using the writings of Leopold along the way to learn about the history and the ecology of the Milwaukee River watershed. So it's been really fun for me to join DNR Greenway here because so much of what we do is engage communities with the Delaware River watershed. So that brings me to some of the projects that I've been working on during my time here. The first one is following in the footsteps of the previous fellow, Nadine Damian. He had this idea for an on-the-water kayak education program out of Bordentown Beach. And the idea is to get students in kayaks on the Delaware River to learn about the history and the ecology of the river from a kayak, just like I did from a canoe on the Milwaukee River all those years ago. So this picture in the upper left-hand corner, that's our beautiful mural at Bordentown Beach, where we'll hopefully be launching the program this spring. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend you check it out. The second thing I've been working on is if you've driven past the Trenton Thunder Stadium on Route 29, you may have seen these little messages about the Delaware River on the big LED marquee outside. So I've been making those so that people who are driving by or are stopped at the stoplight can look up and say, I didn't know that the Delaware River was home to over 200 species of birds. Little things like that to remind people of how important the Delaware River is to our community here. Thirdly, I've been helping out at the Native Plant Nursery. We just finished our fall plant sale. We'll have another one in the spring. So I'll be working on some restoration projects this fall as well. And finally, I'm helping with the planning of our Halloween Masquerade Parade, which will take place on October 31st at St. Michael's Farm Preserve. So keep your eye out for more information on that coming soon. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what I've done, the research I've done in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. So I mentioned I studied ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, and I was lucky enough the summer after my freshman year to work for a grad student who was conducting his own research in this park on plant-herbivore interactions. So how do plant traits influence herbivore behavior, and how do herbivore grazing behaviors in turn influence the evolution of plant traits? So it was a really interesting project in a really, as you can see, beautiful, beautiful place. And Gorongosa National Park also has a really fascinating history, which I unfortunately don't have all the time in the world to talk about now, although I could talk for hours. Essentially, the park was ravaged by a decades-long civil war in the 60s and 70s, which just decimated wildlife populations in the area. And it's only been in the last 15 years or so that there have really been concerted restoration efforts to try to bring those populations back to pre-war levels. So it's a really fascinating place for ecologists because it's a really dynamic ecosystem in the midst of a really successful recovery. So when it came time for me to choose a topic for my senior thesis, I knew I wanted to go back to this park. I knew I wanted to study the system more. And the first thing that came to mind was one of their land management strategies, and that was their controlled burns. So this is a particularly timely topic now, right? When we've looked out the window and we can see the haze from the smoke from the wildfires way out on the other side of the country here, the worst in the history of California. But what a lot of people don't realize is that fire in small doses is actually really essential to promoting the health and the diversity of many ecosystems, particularly the savannah ecosystem. So what's happening in this photo is there's a man, he's a park ranger in Gorongosa, and part of his job is to light a series of cold burns or controlled burns every year in the park. And the purpose of these controlled burns are twofold. First, they remove a lot of the dried biomass, a lot of the dry vegetation to prevent late season fires that could be more dangerous and more destructive later in the season. So by lighting these fires early in the year, when they can control them, they're able to prevent the spread of larger, more dangerous fires later in the year. The second reason they do this is that removing the dried vegetation is one of the best ways to promote really fresh, nutritious regrowth, which is really palatable and attractive to many species of herbivores. So this is a series of 4 photos that was taken by a motion sensing camera. So that's why there's baboons traipsing through each of the photos here. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a date for each of the photos. So over the course of just 2 weeks, an area can go from completely scorched, no vegetation at all, to really lush, new, fresh, full of grass. And it's this fresh regrowth that is particularly attractive to some species of herbivores. So essentially what these controlled burns are doing is they're creating this patchy mosaic of frequently burned, rarely burned, and unburned patches of land. And each of these patches is particularly attractive to certain kinds of herbivores. So what we found is that one of the factors that influences how these animals decide which parts of the land to graze on is body size. So large herbivores like buffalo, hippos, they just need to eat a lot. They don't care so much about the nutrient content of the food they're eating. They don't care about the protein content, for example. They just need to get all the grass they can into their bodies. So these animals, they might prefer to graze in unburned or less frequently burned areas because that has the most biomass, the most vegetation readily available to them. Small herbivores, on the other hand, like small antelopes, they don't have to eat as much. So they need to be more choosy, more selective about eating the most nutritious plants and plant parts, the ones with the highest protein content, for example. And so they might choose to forage in the areas that do burn more frequently, because fire acts is kind of a reset to promote the new, fresh, luscious regrowth. So what we found is that, you know, these controlled burns, in addition to creating this patchy mosaic of different kinds of landscape, is that this is really essential to promoting the diversity of animals in the park, which is really important, especially in a recovering ecosystem like Gorongosa. So it was a really interesting project. I'm so grateful that I got to work on it, and I'm hoping to continue in the future. But the one last thing I want to talk about before I pass it over is an upcoming documentary on Gorongosa National Park on PBS. October 14th at 9 p.m., they're having a special on Nova about predator reintroduction in Gorongosa National Park. And this is actually the work of some of my lab mates at Princeton, and I think it's going to be a really, really interesting show. So if you can, I hope you can tune in to PBS to learn more about Gorongosa National Park and about how wonderful of a place it is. So thanks for tuning in. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Maria. We are so lucky that we have you at DNR Greenway for the next year. I'm even more so now that I've seen you make this presentation. It sounds like it was fascinating work, and it'll be fascinating for you to do it on a very different basis, looking at New Jersey wildlife. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Linda.
So as I mentioned, Allison got started with us because Cindy reached out and asked her about noise research and how that would impact noise on a property that we had preserved. And I have to say thank you to Allison here, because that's been very helpful to us. We've shared that with the landowner, and we're out there right now taking a look at the trails on that preserved property and maintaining the trails and doing the best we can to protect the birds and wildlife there. So thank you for your help with that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Allison, who is there with Clark.
Yeah, I was about to say, this will be my first time giving a talk while giving a baby a bottle. So, you know, here we are. But I think hopefully he cooperates. So we'll see how it goes, right? Okay. I'll share my screen with you all, and we'll get started here. So I'm a behavioral ecologist, and I study noise pollution impacts, and noise pollution impacts on mainly wild birds. So today I'm going to talk to you about just two different systems that I've worked in, and the effects that we've found so far on how noise pollution can affect these species. So noise pollution in the United States is widespread. This map shows the noisier areas, which are the lighter colors, and that those noisier areas are really surrounded, or concentrated, I should say, in urban cities. So you can see each bright dot represents one of the cities in the US, but those cities are also connected by these roadways along which noise travels. The central US is obviously the quiet, or the Midwestern United States is the quietest. And, you know, when we think about noise pollution, the fact that it's low frequency, you know, the pitch of the noise is low, means that it can travel really far distances. So when we think about noise, sure, it's the most concentrated in these urban areas, but it does also affect non-urban habitats. Non-urban habitats besides traffic noise from roadways, are also affected by aircraft noise. So sorry, this picture is a little blurry, but these are all the flight paths in the United States. And you can imagine that if you overlay the traffic noise and the aircraft noise on top of each other, that most of the land area in the United States is affected by some sort of noise pollution. Most animals that live in non-urban areas are not adapted to deal with this. And so you can imagine that right now, animals might be experiencing, you know, an acoustic landscape to which they are not adapted to endure, and that might have negative consequences. So that's where my research kind of jumps in. So I'm going to talk about 3 potential impacts that noise pollution could have on birds. And the first and perhaps most obvious is acoustic communication. So birds, you know, rely on song to defend their territories, to attract mates. And if they live in noisy areas, it's very understandable that they might not be able to hear each other if they're exposed to high levels of anthropogenic noise. The ability to hear each other can degrade habitat quality. So, you know, when we think about habitat, perhaps the most obvious place that our brain goes would be, you know, how much food is available. But if you think of silence as a resource, noise pollution can also change habitat quality by removing this silence that many animals do need in order to get their signals across. Acoustic communication and habitat quality, those changes can kind of scale up to eventually affect survival and reproductive success of wild animals. So, you know, here, if we're thinking about conservation, it's really how does noise affect population health? How would it change the number of new birds, in this case, that are born in any given habitat in any given year? So first, I will focus on acoustic communication. So here, I worked with wood thrush. So wood thrush are declining in their breeding range. Here's a map where the red circles, or red colored circles, represent a decrease in the abundance of wood thrush. Blue colored circles are where wood thrush are increasing. And then the size of the circle is related to the population size. So you can see where wood thrush are most common. That's also the area where they're decreasing the most. I was working in upstate New York in areas that surround the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I'll go into a bit why we chose that area, in part because, you know, I was there. But also, you know, wood thrush are a near threatened species, so they're present in upstate New York, and the numbers are declining. They're on the IUCN Red List. And they are also particularly at risk to being affected by aircraft noise because they are territorial and maintain their territories based on their song. They're migratory, meaning that they wouldn't be exposed to the aircraft noise in their breeding sites year round, and perhaps would be less able to acclimate to those noise regimes. And they have relatively few broods. They suffer high predation rates, and their song has both low and high pitch components. So it's acoustically complex and might be affected by aircraft noise. So I did my work in Sapsucker Woods, which is the bird sanctuary that directly surrounds the Lab of Ornithology. Sapsucker Woods is within this white outline. It's this forested area here. The Lab of Ornithology is underneath this bird symbol. And then this is the airport. So it's less than a mile away. It's small. If you've ever flown in and out of Ithaca, you will know that. But it does have, you know, what we can say a relatively high flight volume in the morning. So here is a demonstration of what the acoustic landscape looks like in Sapsucker Woods between these 3 hours in the morning. And this is, you know, the dawn chorus when acoustic communication for birds is very important. There's these 3 flights here, which are highlighted by these arrows. And so you can see where it's red that these flights took off, and it was very loud and much louder than anything else that's happening in this habitat. So, you know, these aircraft takeoffs really do affect the acoustic landscape that the birds are exposed to. So what we did is we had 30 recording units out in Sapsucker Woods. I went in and listened to lots of data, and then tried to see, are there any patterns between when these flights are taking off and wood thrush song? Are the birds changing their vocal behavior, either their timing of their vocal behavior, the frequency of their vocal behavior, or the patterns to kind of deal with the noise regimes that they're being exposed to from this airport. And what we found was really surprising, in that we found that wood thrush sing more on days with more flights, and in the time periods immediately after a flight, they increase their song, which is, at first I was really surprised by that result. I thought they would sing less, but then when you think about it, I mean, think about how, you would react if it was really noisy and you're trying to tell someone something. Well, often we repeat ourselves. And I think that's basically what the birds are doing here too. They're singing more songs because the likelihood that any one song is actually received by another individual decreases when the background noise is higher. So it looks like noise is changing their behavior. I should also say, singing more, as you can imagine, talking more, it takes more energy, and so there could be some long-term consequence associated with this increased song. Okay, and then I'll just tell you one more quick little story about an experiment I did that looked at habitat quality and the effects of traffic noise pollution on tree swallows. So tree swallows, so I have this little map here, which is kind of mesmerizing. So tree swallows in the winter are in the southern United States. They migrate up north to breed, and then they'll go back down to the southern US in the winters. And so tree swallows, they range across the US, but they are not an urban bird, although they do again exist in these areas that are exposed to noise pollution. Clark's had it. He's like, that's enough talking. Okay, so this study that I did, it was in California. So I did my PhD at UC Davis, and at some field sites there, we set up this experiment where we had very large speakers that played recordings of traffic noise. And what that did is that it created a noise gradient in the tree swallow habitat, where when they came back for migration, males and females had to choose where to settle. Do they choose territories where the background noise levels are higher, or do they preferentially choose to build nests and settle in quieter territories? And what we found was that the birds did preferentially choose to settle in quieter territories. Areas that had lower exposure to our playbacks of traffic noise were settled first, and the individuals that settled in those territories laid more eggs. So birds that were in noisy territories laid fewer eggs and had young with reduced growth. This is in part due to, there can be many mechanisms at play here. It's in part due to lower quality individuals, so lower quality parents settling in noisier areas, and then the nestlings themselves being affected. So those are just two kind of examples of how noise pollution can affect avian population health, and it's affecting these populations and species because of changes in behavior and physiology. So I'm really interested to hear how the pandemic and the fact that people are flying and driving less might mitigate some of these effects, and perhaps that could be one silver lining in this otherwise, kind of negative time. So with that, I'll say thank you.
And thank you, Allison. First off, congratulations. You brought Clark to his
I know, we made it.
Conference, and years to come, you'll share this with him.
I know.
Fabulous job. And one of the comments you made that you said in the beginning, and it really had an impact later on with your research, was think of silence as a resource. I love that statement. Think of silence as a resource. And you brought it back to that at the end with your bird research, and birds preferring quieter territories and laying more eggs and being more successful in quieter territories. So thank you for everything you've shared with us.
All right, yeah.
Now we're going to focus on New Jersey. And David, we are looking forward to your sharing your observations during this time period. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Linda. So let's see. So hopefully this comes through. Okay, can everyone see that? Good. Okay, great. So I'm going to cover a few areas in today's talk. I'm going to start with taking a look at how wildlife has been impacted most directly and visibly from Corona, and more pertinently from the pullback of people, the quarantine and kind of everyone staying indoors for the bulk of a few months. I'm going to then take a look at, and we're going to look at we're going to be back to New Jersey, but we're going to take some quick looks at examples around the world as well. We're going to take a look also at how people and our interaction with conservation and wildlife has changed over that period of time. And then we're going to end up with a closer look at some of the projects here in New Jersey and what some of those impacts have been. A quick aside, as Linda mentioned, I'm the executive director with Conserve Wildlife Foundation. I'm also, I wrote Wild New Jersey, Nature Adventures in the Garden State, and I taught environmental communications at Rutgers for 7 years. A quick word about Conserve Wildlife Foundation. We're a nonprofit that's worked for the past 20 years to protect rare wildlife all around the state and beyond, primarily through field science, habitat restoration, and then education and public engagement in programs like this one. So thank you so much, Linda and DNR Greenway. I wanted to start with, to me, what is kind of a nice microcosm of a wildlife conservation project here in New Jersey, directly impacted by COVID and the ensuing restrictions. So many of you watching may be familiar with the stories of red knots and horseshoe crabs. A quick summary for those who aren't. The red knot is a robin-sized shorebird that, along with other endangered and at-risk shorebirds, flies in massive numbers and all the way up from South America and the furthest tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, all the way up to New Jersey every spring, every May in particular, and descends in May in great numbers along the Delaware Bay shore of Cape May and Cumberland County. And it does so because only that location on the whole East Coast can offer horseshoe crab eggs in great numbers. And so here, this is a timeless migration. It's a world-class, globally significant migration that's been happening for eons. And these horseshoe crab eggs are the one thing that can provide the fuel and energy that for red knots and other shorebirds to continue their journey all the way up to the Arctic. So this small bird making this incredible journey every year is remarkable in its own right. The horseshoe crab is also a remarkable story in its own right as this prehistoric creature that still swims the waters today and has adapted so well in so many ways. But both of these are imperiled, and that's where Conserve Wildlife Foundation and our biologists come into play. We, along with many partners, have been studying this for the past 20 years, studying this migration. And for decades now, the numbers have declined sharply. These are birds and crabs are both at risk of everything from climate change and sea level rise to major storms like Hurricane Sandy, to, in the case of the horseshoe crabs, hunting and poaching, which New Jersey has now, in recent years, has outlawed, but prior to that, they had been taken in great numbers. And so these are, the point being, these are globally significant species that are very much on the edge of potentially losing them without the protection of scientists. And so for the past 20 years, this global wildlife spectacle has been accompanied with a global scientific focus. And so in other years, in what we'll call normal years, i.e. not 2020, we have scientists flying in, experts in this field, flying in from every continent on the globe, from Brazil and Canada, and then Europe, Asia, Africa, flying in to spend the month of May here in Delaware Bay in New Jersey to study the horseshoe crabs and the shorebirds. And they do this, they catch the birds, they basically do these incredible netting exercises whereby they shoot nets out of a cannon, catch the birds, band them, take measurements, check their health, do all this incredible things and do it within a few minutes so that birds can go on their way. And at the same time, they're also studying everything from grain sizes to water quality to water levels and where the crabs are found. It's a remarkable and incredible study, and it's dependent on having these expert scientists. Well, you can imagine in 2020 how that went over. So shortly before May, a couple months before, like everything else, the whole study was called into question. We were very close to having to cancel it entirely. What ended up happening is we were able to, through our hardy scientists, conduct a scaled down version. None of those international scientists could fly in for obvious reasons. So we basically, with 10% of our scientific force, we made do and did the best that they could do. And so essentially this is what the 2020 version of that mass gathering that you saw in prior years. And so to their credit, they still managed to do a number of bandings. They did as many surveys as they could do, and they tried to cover as much ground as they could. But I think I did mention this is the year 2020. So even that wasn't enough of a twist. What we also had to find in this never ceasing to surprise us year is that once they were all set, okay, we know our scaled back operation, we're going to be able to make this work as well as we can. What happened? The birds arrived, and at this point in early to mid-May, the waters were extremely cold by Delaware Bay standards. There was a northeasterly winds coming through for over a week, and the crabs were not coming ashore to spawn, and thus the birds did not find what they were looking for. And within a few days, we saw about an 80% decline in the bird numbers, literally overnight. Somehow in their bird minds, they made the decision, we're moving on. We can't wait for the waters to warm, the crabs to lay their eggs, and we are moving on. So what ended up happening, we did with a scaled down team, we also did a much scaled down count. And it very much calls into question what's going to happen next year. As the birds go up to the Arctic to breed in the summer this year, many of them went without having that energy, without being refueled? Did they make it? Were they able to successfully breed? And we're going to be finding out to some degree in the fall return migration, and then next year when we do the count, hopefully closer to normally as we've done in the past. But this was a case of in kind of that typical synchronicity we've all become used to in 2020. We adapt as well as we can, but then there's still factors out of our control. And so pretty incredible project that really does hang in the balance right now. And we're kind of anxiously awaiting to see how the birds fared over the next 6 months. So flashing back a few months prior to that, we all know that, of course, when COVID arrived, it was very much tied into wildlife issues in and of itself. Everything from clearing, in many cases, virgin tropical forest, and clearing for things like gathering bushmeat and burning for charcoal and hunting, subsistence hunting. Of course, part of that process then became illegal wildlife trade, the consumption of wildlife, the wet markets, live animal markets. All of these combined created these ideal vehicles for the different forms of COVID, including COVID-19, of course. And within a few months, it spread around the globe, as we all know. And then lo and behold, we all awoke one morning, and depending for each of us, sometime in mid-March, let's call it, and found out that we were extras on the set of Contagion, kind of bouncing back and forth between Jude Law on one end and Kate Winslet on the other. Lucky us, right? And so as we were stuck inside, however, wildlife was not cooperating at all. They were not quarantining, and they were out breaking it. I'm going to just do a quick run through of some of the pretty incredible stories around the globe. You had Kashmiri goats in Wales, more or less commandeering a town. You had wild boar in places like Barcelona and Haifa, Israel. You had kangaroos hopping down the street in Sydney. Predators, you had jackals making themselves at home in comfortable suburban and urban parks in Israel and other places in the Middle East. You had endangered civets showing up in cities in India. And in places like safari parks, in some of the places in Africa, roads that would normally be filled with one Range Rover with tourists toting very expensive cameras after another. Instead, you had the big cats warming themselves on the pavement with nary a human in sight. There was also interesting stories of wildlife that typically those were wildlife that basically saw no humans and came in. There's also cases of wildlife that depend on humans, that look for food and handouts. You had deer in a number of different cities, Japan and elsewhere, peacocks in Dubai and other places in the Middle East. You had monkeys in Thailand that were very popular for tourists and visitors to local temples who would basically lived on handouts. All of a sudden, there's very few tourists. And what ensued was literally a street brawl between two rival gangs of these monkeys before they finally dispersed. And so everything thrown out of whack for a lot of these wildlife species. Even in our waterways globally, you had dolphins swimming past the incredibly busy port of Istanbul and the Straits of Bosphorus. You had fin whales swimming up along the coast of France, along busy ports, flamingos gathering by the thousands in urban Indian waterfronts, and sea turtles nesting comfortably, finally without disruption by humans in many places in Brazil and Florida. And granted, yes, in Florida being one case, but many others too. In the US, we saw a lot of the same things. Coyotes, which have always made themselves at home in recent decades in cities and suburbs around the US, were much more visible in doing so. Turkeys, wild turkeys, seemed to take over Harvard for a few days as they were the only living creature seen on campus for a while. Turkeys taking over to Harvard. You can insert your own joke there. And mountain lions. In downtown Boulder, you had mountain lions literally on Pearl Street Mall, the busiest pedestrian walkway in the city, taking a lunchtime nap just above the walkway in yards right alongside it. Literally, we opened up a lot of these towns and cities for many weeks on end for wildlife to come in and reclaim it in their own way. Here in New Jersey was no different. We had red foxes seen in numbers. I personally saw over the course of a couple of weeks, I saw more than I had seen in the last 3 years combined. Just out and about, especially if you went out at dusk or shortly after. Amphibians and reptiles suddenly were able to cross the roads right during their, and I'm going to come back to this, but right during their peak migration season, able to cross roads safely for the first time in decades in many cases. You had nocturnal wildlife like owls and nightjars, a lot of the nocturnal mammals like opossums, raccoons, all of a sudden being able to much more safely use our roadways and in the cases of owls and nightjars, fly low along these roadways without the risk, with a fraction of the risk of being hit by a vehicle, one of their biggest threats. And bears, of course, you saw it in Yosemite in massive numbers, but here in New Jersey, we had a 93% increase in bear sightings and encounters in 2020 versus the prior year. We also had more of what the state terms, kind of difficult encounters. So more than just a sighting, not quite an attack, but sort of like somewhere in between nuisance bears in a sense. We had an increase in that as well. And in many cases, the sightings, as with a lot of these wildlife species, it was a mix of the wildlife being much more out and about, but also people being much more inside, and thus someone who might have been at work and unable to, wouldn't have never had a chance to be looking out their window at 11:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. They were looking out that window and seeing the bear walking across the backyard, crisscrossing between two wooded areas. So it was kind of a mix of the two. And so there is a precedent for this, and a very proven and demonstrated one for what happens when wildlife, when people scale back our presence, when we're removed or remove ourselves from an area, wildlife increasing. And it very much is this kind of inverse relationship. And we've seen it in literally the worst places in the world. Chernobyl, of course, with the '80s nuclear meltdown, now dozens of acres all around Chernobyl and in all directions, dozens of miles rather, in all directions, is now essentially a world-class nature preserve. You have European bison and black bear, you have elk and lynx, Przewalski's horse, an incredibly endangered horse, all returning in great numbers, much greater numbers now in this, unwitting preserve, which formerly has become a preserve, than in the surrounding countryside. Dramatic increases. Similarly, in the Korean DMZ, between North Korea and South Korea, here in this no man's land of unexploded ordnance and armed guards on either side, this relatively narrow corridor is essentially a last holdout for a lot of rare wildlife, everything from Amur leopards to different crane species and to goral and other long-tailed eagles. A really incredible wildlife resource right now between the two Koreas. In the Japanese Fukushima meltdown disaster from the typhoon, you had similar, a lot of that is now off limits, and you have everything from raccoon dog to goral and different monkeys that you do not see in any kind of number in the more populated areas nearby, and yet they're having a renaissance in this area. And none of this is in any way to diminish the very real threats of the contamination or the radiation, depending on the case, including to the wildlife, although in many cases it's not as dramatic as it is to us. It's not to diminish that, but rather to point out it really is a pretty clear relationship that for many wildlife species, as human impact goes down, their presence becomes much more comfortable and goes up. In New Jersey, we see that as well. What are much lesser harmful, but nonetheless not great sites, Superfund sites, old factory grounds that are off limits, that have been off limits for decades, military bases. These areas now are wildlife holdouts in many ways as the suburbs have developed further and further around them. These areas, I've seen with my own eyes, species that would be really tough to see. You get a few blocks in either direction from the site, but you're seeing these species holding out in these areas. So again, it's a pretty remarkable relationship. The impact on us has been very much a pretty interesting dichotomy as well. So on one hand, we were stuck indoors for a couple of months entirely, and then many of us have still stayed in many ways, spending as much time as possible indoors, minimizing risk, etc. And oddly enough, and Linda hinted at this as well, is oddly enough, that was one of the things that I think has really triggered a renaissance for people being interested and aware and wanting to reconnect with nature. And so maybe that could be a silver lining here. We've seen that at Conserve Wildlife Foundation. We've seen that with our wildlife webcams, our osprey cams in Long Beach Island, and falcon cams in Jersey City and Union County, and then the Duke Farms Eagle Cam. More viewers, more interaction than ever before, more general interest in seeing what's happening and getting involved, making it a part of people's day. It's been great to see. For zoos and aquariums, it's been a challenge as well. You see in many of these cases, they had to stop visitors, they had to cut staff. Two things that really jumped out as being interesting. One, of course, some of the big cats in the Bronx Zoo actually got COVID through the keepers, which is pretty scary. Fortunately, they didn't die. It was a case they were able to fight off, but definitely it was a big open question as how much that could have gotten worse from there. And social animals that actually depend on that human relationship, we talked about a little bit earlier as well. For those social animals, it was a bit of a challenge for them. They suddenly had to have that relationship reciprocated in some way. And so zoos got creative in terms of still making that happen, whether with the keepers or doing really innovative virtual Zoom events, like having penguins walk through an aquarium hall the same way people would, and broadcasting it all over the internet. We saw, when we did have the chance to go outside, we saw it even more so among all of us. Of course, anyone going out at any point during the spring, and I think it's continued through the summer, it's always struck me, we're seeing, to my mind, we're seeing 5, 6, 10 times more people outdoors, enjoying the outdoors than we would have seen in any other year. We're seeing people out there bird watching, biking. It could be pushing a stroller, walking the dogs, jogging, gardening. People just reconnecting in so many ways with nature and getting that fresh air. People at the beach in great numbers, and that's been a fluctuating thing, which I'll come back to, but at great numbers even before summer. You saw just people finding that chance to reconnect with nature and wildlife in whatever way they could. Even among those who are already deeply invested in wildlife, bird watchers, for instance. So the sudden appearance, this all coincided with spring migration, with all the plants coming into bloom, basically the whole natural world reawakening at the same time that we were all forced in. And so this dichotomy really came to me, came out when I saw the reactions to common species like the gray catbird. I remember I was walking my dog early spring and heard the first catbird that I had heard of the year. Very common bird. And so, that's cool that they're back. And of course I get back, and on some of the bird email lists by the end of that day, 3-4 other people excitedly posting the gray catbirds are back. And that really struck me as it just showed how much, I think it reinforced that we either were missing nature or we already valued it, but we didn't want to lose it. And that became abundantly clear throughout this. Of course, when we did get out in nature, it was a much different experience, as we saw with family reunions like this. Keep your distance. Social distancing never far from people's mind, as it continues to be now, rightfully, in visits to parks and nature areas. And it was a real roller coaster. We had that initial run where parks suddenly were super crowded in late March, leading to the state and other organizations having to close and scale back on many of their parks and nature centers and wildlife management areas. And then, so suddenly no one's there, and then suddenly reopening with these limits. And so it's been a roller coaster, and the wildlife has kind of more or less had to adapt and adjust accordingly. For us, we've been, of course, the social distancing. It's all those great helpful signs for those bird watchers out there. Just picture a turkey vulture's wingspan. For you fishermen and women out there, just picture the length of a fishing rod. And I think for all of us, I can say with certainty that the easiest way for any of us to remember it is the next time you're in Whole Foods, am I too close to the person in front of me in line? Just picture an Atlantic sturgeon, roughly 26 years old, in front of me. And if they're there, then I'm good. So yeah, these people got to have fun with this, right? But the impacts to conservation have been serious. But what I want to do is lead here with a positive story. The bald eagle has been what I would say, for us, it's been our one truly positive outcome from the crazy year that it's been. We're announcing very shortly that bald eagles in New Jersey, this year we set new records with 200 plus nesting pairs and over 300 young bald eagles fledging, meaning they grew up enough to leave the nest for good. And both of those are records, and it's not a coincidence. The fact that people were in during the key times that the eagles were nesting absolutely benefited them. One of the reasons being is one of the biggest threats to nesting bald eagles is people getting too close to the nest, or in some way, as Allison mentioned, it could be noise, it could be the physical presence, or any other kind of disruption, but disrupting either their caring for their young or their hunting and foraging. By not doing that, by not having those impacts, we got to see the result of the eagles having a banner year. So there's your unmitigated positive news for the day. Many of our other projects were much more mixed bags. I mentioned with reptiles and amphibians, the positive is that similarly as we've talked about with some of the other projects, by cars being off the road, it made a huge difference. So every spring we hold an amphibian crossing project where we partner with the state and with other groups in key areas where amphibians spend their winter basically underground, warmly underground, and then cross whatever local roads to get to vernal pools, these ephemeral pools of water that don't have fish in them because they dry out part of the year. So they're safe for the amphibian tadpoles to grow from there. And so we had, for reptiles and amphibians, these crossings we hold each spring as they're doing that migration and save thousands of them every year. This year, because cars were so scaled back, and because it really did coincide with literally the peak of migration and the peak of the restrictions for COVID, we pulled back our biologists. We didn't end up having a number of the crossing nights after the first couple, mainly because we didn't need to, because there was so little activity that it was simply a positive for the reptiles and amphibians to make it across. The one concern is that we didn't get the data that we would normally get, but judging from some of the other states, Maine, for instance, they saw a doubling of the rate of successful crossings versus road-killed crossings for amphibians. They saw it doubled this year with all the less road traffic. So that's a positive sign. We're anxious to see next year what kind of numbers we get compared with our historic numbers. Our other projects, again, are mixed bags. You had most of our work could continue to go through, but we did have to scale it back quite a bit. Similarly to the shorebirds and red knots that I mentioned in the beginning. Our osprey project, we were still able to do a lot of our counts and surveys to some degree, but we had to scale back on things like we couldn't put up osprey platforms. Why? That needs a group of volunteers working together. No longer much of an option right now, at least not at this moment in time. Peregrine falcons, we were able to continue to do our work, but again, in a scaled back way, not nearly as much volunteer involvement. And our beach nesting birds kind of mirrored, and that would be like piping plover, American oystercatcher, least tern. That kind of mirrored the challenge for us as people in terms of our outdoor experience as a roller coaster. Our scientists who work so closely on these species went from being worried about thinking, okay, good, they'll finally have their, not good, but the positive is they'll finally have the space they need to nest without disruption. Then finding out soon after, okay, all of a sudden now everyone's flocking to the beaches. Now it may be worse than a typical year. And then again, some beaches open, some closed. It ended up being a very scattershot approach naturally because everyone was figuring it out as they went. But amazingly enough, the beach nesting birds ended up having a relatively typical year. They're still doing all the counts, but it didn't end up dramatically increasing them in either way. But what it did hammer home is just how crucial it is to have that preparation and for each town or region to have that plan in place for this kind of event, making sure that again, like with all our projects, it's so timely. You literally have just a few week window. In this case, typically June being a key month, where the birds can't be disrupted, or we could lose them entirely. And so we got to see that, got to see the threat of that playing out in all directions with beach nesting birds, and we're fortunate that they were able to continue as planned. Some of the other groups, I know a lot of the nature centers had to close. Audubon just reopened theirs, or just announced they're reopening theirs. Wildlife Center in Mercer County all of a sudden had to make do with almost no volunteers. So literally losing a huge amount of their workforce, and still having to care for all the wildlife, injured and sick wildlife brought in. So it's been overwhelming for a lot of groups, including ours in many ways. But yet we still have, I believe, in looking at longer term, we're still positioned to adapt with adaptations to survive this and still maintain everything. I can't say that with the same confidence in other parts of the world that would happen. Some of the major wildlife tourism destinations in places like Africa and India, initially it was welcomed as a positive, at least in the short term, that with the lack of international travel, there would be less trophy hunting. There would be some of those impacts would reduce, similar to how we saw in New Jersey and elsewhere. Wildlife would be a little more free to move around. And that may have been the initial reaction. But as we saw the economic impact spread and this become a much more entrenched global problem, you now look at the nearly wiped out ecotourism dollars that would have been spent that are the driving force in many communities in many of these nations. You saw without that, all of a sudden, the conservation efforts in these parts of the world are susceptible to everything from a renewed emphasis on poaching, on clearing land and forests and jungle, similar to how we saw that COVID-19 even began in the first place. And of course, more illegal wildlife trade. So all those negatives, and without having the funding to help, continue to power the rangers who are putting their lives on the line to fight poaching and to protect this wildlife, it very much puts up in the air all the great progress that's been made in many of these regions of the world over the last few decades, especially as the model has become to work much closer with the local communities. Now, in many cases, these conservation groups aren't even able to get over there, at least not in the numbers they had been typically. So it's very much a big challenge that's open-ended. How does this, what does this mean for the future beyond questions like that? To me, the biggest connection is this is our dry run for climate change. And as we see, we haven't exactly been very proactive as a society in fighting climate change. And it still is out there as just as big a problem, except bigger than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. But what COVID-19 speaks to the fight against climate change is it captures that, one, this is an incredibly complex problem. There's multiple factors that go into causing it, and there's multiple solutions. There's not one magic bullet solution that just can fix everything. It's costly. It involves international cooperation. It involves the need for leadership from major countries around the world taking the lead, the same way a global fight against COVID would require that. It's also, just like COVID too, it unfortunately has a very rabid opposition of deniers with climate change, as we have in many ways with COVID, which challenges things as well. And it's not exactly the easiest concept to get across. Once it becomes talked about, we're like with COVID, we're learning as we go. Climate change, we've learned enough to know it's a massive concern, but the gray areas that are still being debated lend ammunition for those who want to just deny it. So again, what I'm hopeful is that some of the lessons we're seeing where we have been successful, certain things where we have been successful in COVID-19 as a global society, that some of those we can bring over to the fight with climate change. And I'll leave it with one positive here. One of the best examples of this was seeing just literally in a 1 month period as China had their shutdown, seeing the removing fossil fuels from the equation, or at least cutting them back to a fraction. You literally could see the result. You could see it in the air, in the impacts to people's health, and you could see it in the NO2 graphs and charts. You could just see how much it made a difference, and that is in 1 month. So on one hand, it gives us hope that we can still make changes. On the other hand, it should hopefully give us that impetus to actually start doing that as a society, and that's what my hope is. And yes, you also as individuals can make a difference. Everything from strengthening habitat in your own yard or community, your business, your church, everything from native plantings to putting up bird feeders or bat boxes. Of course, volunteering is as good as you can get. I know it's tougher right now, but whenever volunteering becomes much more accessible and you feel safe health-wise to do that, I couldn't encourage you more to volunteer at places like DNR or Conserve Wildlife or any other groups locally. Contributing and advocating are huge. And this year, more than ever, make sure you get out there and vote. That's my strongest urging. For any more information about any of the things we talked about or any of the wildlife, particularly at-risk wildlife in New Jersey, feel free to check out our website. And with that, I thank you so much, Linda and DNR Greenway.
Well, David, thank you so much for a fascinating talk and for sharing some amazing pictures with us from around the world. Those were fascinating. And I heard so many things about New Jersey that I was quickly writing down, such as the additional bear sightings that are out there and the great news on eagles. And I know one of our staff, Deb Kilmer, has been a longtime volunteer with your organization,
Thank you, Deb.
looking at monitoring the eagle nest in Lambertville. So I know that she has a special place in her heart for that. I also wanted to say that when you gave your talk, there was kind of one iconic slide that stuck with me, which was impact rediscovering nature. And I really think that's what people are doing right now. And I think about the preservation of habitats and how important it is that first we preserve and then we manage. And to manage, we need the work that your conservation biologists are doing to tell us what are the trends, what's happening, where do we find the wildlife, and how do we best protect it. So thank you for your work. And thank you to all three of our speakers. This has been an incredible experience. I know for me, I've enjoyed it tremendously and I've learned a lot, and I hope all of you have learned a lot as well. We are really creating a virtual community, and I'm seeing a thank you on the chat. And we're creating a great virtual community through these talks. So I encourage people to come back and join us again. The next one we have scheduled will be on October 21st, and we'll be talking about the Victory Gardens at our St. Michael's Farm Preserve. They've just completed their first inaugural year, or they're in the midst of harvest on the first inaugural year. And we'll be hearing as well from one of the owners of Aunt Chubby's in Hopewell, who has been receiving produce from the charity plots and distributing that to 30 needy families in Hopewell. Another wonderful thank you to all of our speakers. So with that, I would just like to invite people, please come out on DNR Greenway trails. Our open space is open. It's a great place to bird watch and see wildlife. And as we sign off, I want to invite you to unmute yourself and join me in an applause for our incredible speakers tonight. And if you prefer, on the chat, you can go down below and see where it says reactions, and you can also put a little reaction in the corner of your screen. So for those that have unmuted, let's give some applause to these three incredible speakers. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And final reminder, if you'd like to get an email with the research papers that Allison has been kind enough to say she will share, please send an email to Deb Kilmer, who sent you the Zoom invite, and we will get you that information along with some more linkages. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye.
Yeah.